How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 97 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf Zayin is a very exciting daf because we begin Ta'arovos. If my understanding is that this is like the big one. This is the big sugya. I don't have smicha. I'm not a rabbi. I never learned this stuff in any official capacity or ever. But my understanding is that this is like the big thing that you study if you want to be a rabbi. So I'm pretty excited about this. So we're going to start today talking about like min b'mino and that kind of stuff, which is cool. Ta'arovos, mixtures, shishim, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to learn a Mishnah today where we're going to talk about Gid Anosha and if you cook with the Gid Anosha, is that food going to be kosher or not? The Gemara is going to talk about cooking versus roasting, a little bit of a nafka mina there. How to check for flavor is interesting. Yeah, how exactly do we test to know if the flavor of the forbidden food is being tasted in the larger dish? Different ways to check for that. Then, of course, we will be discussing the concept of shishim, 60 parts to 1 part, batal b'shishim, how to calculate shishim. If we're looking at a pot full of food, what can be included in the calculation and what is excluded from the calculation. And finally, we'll get to a little bit of a tricky sugya of udders. If a cow's udder, which of course has meat, but also has milk in it, what are the considerations if an udder gets mixed into some meat? So friends, that's what we have to look forward to today on Daf Zayin. I'm pretty excited about it. We're going to have a few days now of Ta'arovos, I think until the next Mishnah. So on Daf Kuf. So we have a few days now of Ta'arovos. I'm very much looking forward to it. I hope that you'll enjoy it along with me. Come join me. Let's have a great time studying Daf Zayin of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Vov Omid Beis at the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Yarich is Bashal Gid Anosha. How exciting is this? If you have a hind leg that was cooked in a pot, and this hind leg was cooked in a pot with its Gid Anosha still in it. And the question is, does the Gid Anosha, which you're not allowed to eat obviously, does it impart flavor in the rest of the meat? If the rest of the meat contains the flavor of the Gid Anosha, it's all shaila. If yesh begidin b'nosein tam or not, do sinews have flavor that can be imparted in other things? For now, let's assume yes. So right, Yaroshin is bashal ba Gid Anosha im yesh ba b'nosein tam. If the Gid Anosha is imparting flavor in the rest of the meat, in the rest of the hind leg, harezo asura, so then the hind leg is asur. If the Gid Anosha is imparting flavor in the meat of the hind leg, so then it is asur. Now, part of the cheshbin over Tosfos talks about, are we only considering the Gid Anosha and the meat of the leg? What about if there's what if there are other things in the pot? Can we consider that? It's a bit of a shaila. I think as we get more into the sugya, it has to deal with a few other things. So, anyways, it's a bit. There's 2 shittas in Tosfos. One shitta says that be'etzem you can include the rest of the things in the pot, and therefore it would be if the Gid Anosha, right, is the bit okay. If there are basically 60 parts of other things, keneged the Gid Anosha, meaning of the meat and everything else in the pot, but there's another shita that says it's really only just the Gid Anosha and the meat, and we're not talking about other things. So, anyways, there's different ways you could think about that. I was just pointing it out. Part of what we're gonna get to later in the daf is like what exactly could be considered when calculating shishim, which we haven't even gotten to shishim yet. But in terms of this calculation of the Gid Anosha and imparting flavor in what? Let's just say, is the Gid Anosha imparting flavor literally just in the hind leg? What about the fact that it's cooked with other things? Can those other things be considered together as part of the cheshbin of what the gid anasha would be imparting flavor in. Obviously, the more other things there are, the more diluted the flavor is going to be. So what exactly are we considering over here? It's a bit of a question that involves lots of other things, including, is the pot covered? Is the pot not covered? Are you mixing things through? We're not getting into any of this stuff now, but I just wanted to kind of point out that there is a question of what exactly is included in this cheshbon. Now that we've mentioned it, don't worry about it. For now, let's just say, like Tosfos' first shita, which is that we're just talking about the gid anasha and the meat of the leg itself. Let's just say that for now. So you have the gid anasha, it's cooked together with the meat, with the leg. And so we're saying, im yesh ba benosein tam, if the gid anasha is imparting flavor in the meat, in the rest of the meat of the leg, harezo asura, so then the meat of that hind leg is Issur because it's imparted with the flavor of the gid anasha. The gid anasha is obviously Issur. Ketzad Mashayrin Osa. So the Gemara, the Mishnah asked an interesting question. Now, how do we evaluate flavor? I mentioned shishim a few minutes ago. Let's not talk about shishim until the Gemara talks about shishim. For now, let's take things literally. Yesh ba benosein tam. Does it impart flavor? Can you literally taste the gid anasha in the meat? How are you going to know? Are you you can't taste the meat. That's risky. Where you're going to taste the meat and say, you're playing with fire over there. What if you do taste the gid anasha? You just ate gid anasha, right? You just ate Issur meat. So how do you make such a cheshbon if after all, you're not allowed to actually taste it because we're not, playing with fire over there? Are you going to be eating gid anasha or not? So, Ketzad Mashayrin Osa. So how do we evaluate it? Kibasur belefes. This is what you do. We say basically an equivalent thing that you can use to test this is that, you can't now dig into the meat to see if you can taste the gid anasha or not, because that's risky. What if you can taste the gid anasha? You just ate gid anasha. So what you do is you say, well, a parallel scenario, which is completely mutter, is meat in turnips. If basically you would say, here's the gid anasha, here's the rest of the leg, and the proportion of gid anasha to the rest of the leg, if we would have a proportion of meat to turnip, would you be able to taste the meat in the turnip? And you can go, take a bunch of turnips, take some meat, same ratios as gid anasha to the meat of the leg. You would take now the meat to the turnips, and you would cook them all together, take a bite of a turnip, and say, do I taste meat or not? If you would taste the meat, so then you would say, okay, well, I guess we would be able to taste the gid anasha then in the rest of the leg. If you say, I can't taste the meat in these turnips, well then, that means that you would be unable to taste the gid anasha in the rest of the leg, and it would be okay. Again, from the beginning, Yarshin is bashabo gid anasha, a leg that the gid anasha was cooked in it. Im yesh ba benosein tam, if you can taste the gid anasha in the meat of the leg. Harezo asura, it's Issur. How are we going to actually know if you would be able to taste the gid anasha in the rest of the leg? Ketzad Mashayrin Osa kibasur belefes, as though it were meat with turnips. If you'd be able to taste the meat in the turnips, so then the assumption is you'd be able to taste the gid anasha in the leg. If not, not. Let me chop a shluck of coffee and we'll go weiter. Says the Mishnah, gid anasha shenes bashel im agidim. What if you have gid anasha that was together with other sinews, other gidim? You had a pot, and in the pot there were a whole bunch of sinews, including the gid anasha. So the gid anasha is Issur, but the rest of the sinews are mutter. This is min b'mino, right? When you have the gid anasha in the leg, so that's min b'she'eno mino. You have the gid anasha has a distinct flavor from the rest of the meat, and you could theoretically taste the rest of the meat and see, do I taste the gid anasha in the rest of the meat? Here we have min b'mino, gid anasha, the sciatic nerve, that's being cooked with other nerves and sinews. They all taste the same. So Rashi points out over here in the Rashi Dibra Maskov B'Nosin Tam, who the common first the Nosin Tam b'min b'mino she'en adam yochel avchino shiro b'shishim. So we don't say anything about shishim yet in the Mishnah, but Rashi already points out for us that here we have a situation of no saying min b'mino. So we have the gid anasha gets mixed together with other gidim, and they all taste the same. So how are you gonna taste for the gid anasha? They all taste the same. So Rashi already points out that And as we're going to see later on the daf, there are scenarios where the only option we have really is shishim. We'd make a cheshbon of it's 60 parts of permitted sinews to the gid anosha. So now back in the Mishnah, so gid anosha shen is bashel imagidim. So if you have the gid anosha that gets mixed together with a whole bunch of other sinews, so bisman shemakiro. So if you recognize the gid anosha and you're looking at all of these sinews that are being cooked together, and you say, I can identify the gid anosha, so obviously pull it out so that you're not going to eat it. So pull it out, but then there's the question of flavor. So benosein tam. So once you pull out the gid anosha from the mixture of all those gidim, so you pull out the gid anosha, now there's just the question remains of flavor. Has the gid anosha imparted its flavor in the rest of the permitted gidim? And as Rashi points out, that would be b'shishim, right? Basically, we would make a cheshbon of is the gid anosha 1 part to 60 parts of the others. Okay, so if you can recognize the gid anosha, pull it out, and then there's the cheshbon of shishim, of nosein tam, which is essentially shishim, right? 60 parts of heter to 1 part of Issur is essentially a stand-in for nosein tam. So if you can taste the gid anosha in the mixture, so then it's also v'im lav. Now, if you can't recognize the gid anosha, well then kulan asurin. Well then the whole mixture is asur, because any of those gidim that you eat, it might be the gid anosha if you can't recognize which one is the gid anosha. Rashi points out that we're going to ask in the Gemara, not today, but we're going to ask in the Gemara, why can't we say batal birov, right? If we have a whole bunch of gidim and one of them is a gid anosha and we can't recognize it and they're all mixed together, why do we have to assume that the whole thing is also? Can't we say it's batal birov? So we'll have to answer that question. Okay. Ve'arote b'nosein tam. And either way, what about the sauce itself? Right? What about, if there's any liquids in the pot? So regardless of if you took out the gid anosha or if you didn't recognize the gid anosha and it's in there, in terms of the rote of the liquid in the pot itself, that would be b'nosein tam. If you would be able to taste the gid anosha in the liquid that's in the pot, so that would be b'nosein tam. If you could taste it in the liquid, so then it's also, if not, it is mutter. Okay, givaldik. Okay, so you have the gid anosha, it falls in together with a whole bunch of sinews. If you recognize it, pull it out, and then the question is it b'nosein tam? If you can't recognize it, the whole mixture is asur. In terms of the liquid, it's going to be a question of, either way, it's going to be a question of nosein tam. V'chein chaticha shel nevela, v'chein chaticha shel dog tameh. And similarly, if a piece of nevela meat falls into a pot of other meat, or non-kosher fish falls into a pot of kosher fish, that got cooked together with other pieces, bisman shemakiran, same thing. If you recognize it, take it out, b'nosein tam. And then the question is simply, did it impart flavor or not? V'im lav. But if you don't recognize it, kulan asuros, all of the pieces are asur, so we have to be concerned that each piece that you eat might be the asur piece. Ve'arote b'nosein tam. And in terms of the liquid that's in the pot, the question is there the flavor of the asur piece in the liquid or not? Unbelievable. Okay, we are hitting the road here with ta'arovos. In a chaper look of coffee, and we're gonna go weiter. Now says the Gemara, now, when we said in the Mishnah that if the gid anosha is nosein tam, so then the whole leg, the whole hind leg is asur. That's dafka because we're talking about bishul, cooking in a pot. Avon nitzla, but if we're talking about roasting over fire, avon nitzla ba kolev ba'ochel ad shemagia legid. But if we're talking about roasting over fire, so then we don't assume that the whole leg is asur. Rather, you can eat the layers of meat until you get to the Gid Anosha. Then you have to stop eating. So when we're talking about cooking, so the assumption is, what does Rashi say? That any liquids in the pot that it's cooking in are going to penetrate. The liquids are going to penetrate the flavor of the Gid Anosha in all of the meat. But if we're talking about roasting over fire, that's not the case, and you can actually eat all the meat up until you get to the Gid Anosha, then obviously you have to stop so as not to eat the Gid Anosha. Ini, is this really true that when we're talking about roasting, it's permitted as long as you're avoiding the Issur itself? Rav Huna, says Rav Huna, Gdish etzlo bichelbo, if you cook a kid, a goat, and it has its chaylev inside of it, Rashi says, Shlonoto chaylev aklayus, that you didn't remove the chaylev from the kidneys, and the chaylev of the kidneys is in the goat as you are roasting it. Osur lechol afilu mirosh ozno. You are not allowed to eat any bit of that kid, of that goat, even from a part of its ears, where there's no chaylev there at all. Even there you can't eat, because the assumption is that the chaylev spread, the flavor of the chaylev spread throughout the goat, throughout the kid. So on the one hand, we had said a second ago that by the Gid Anosha, if you roast the kid, or if you roast the leg, so you can eat the meat until you get to the Gid Anosha, then you got to stop. Yet we see that says Rav Huna, if you roast a kid, a little goat, if you roast the kid and you didn't remove the chaylev, so the assumption is that you cannot just eat all the meat until you get to the chaylev. Rather, the chaylev permeated, the flavor of the chaylev permeated throughout the kid. Shiny chaylev, yeah, but that's different. Chaylev is different than the Gid Anosha, dimifaipeya, because it bubbles. The chaylev, the fat, is going to bubble, going to, melt and break down and bubble and spread throughout the kid. But the Gid Anosha won't. And therefore, if you roast the Gid Anosha, if you roast the leg, you can eat the meat of the leg until you get to the Gid Anosha, then you got to stop. Uvechelev osur, is that really so? Questions the Gemara, that by chaylev it's osur because it will permeate all of the meat. Omar Rabbi Bar Chana, but says Rabbi Bar Chana, uvdahava kamei de Rabbi Yochanan. There was once a scenario, there was once a case that came before Rabbi Yochanan b'knishta de Ma'on, in the synagogue at Ma'on, bigdi shetzlo b'chelbo, with this exact scenario, apparently, with a kid that was roasted with its chaylev. They said, what do we do? We didn't remove the chaylev of the kidneys. I watched recently a butchering video, as I mentioned recently, and there was this guy who was butchering a kid, a lamb, and inside the lamb, the kidneys were still there. Right? He got, they sent him, he was a butcher, and he ordered a whole lamb, obviously with its guts and everything cleaned out. And he was going to break it up into, he's a butcher, breaking it up into the cuts that he wants. But the kidneys were still in there. He had to, he pulls out the kidneys and he can use them. He uses them for meat. But so they emptied out the kid and they roasted it, but the kidneys were still in there. So they asked Rabbi Yochanan, what do we do? The kidneys were in there and the chaylev was still on the kidneys. And his response was, you can eat the meat, eat the layers of meat until you get to the chaylev of the kidneys, and then you got to stop. So here, this is our exact case. They roasted a kid with the chaylev of the kidneys, and while we said a few minutes ago, the whole kid is also even behind its ears, where there's no chaylev, but the chaylev, the flavor spread throughout the kid, and yet Rabbi Yochanan said, you can eat all the meat until you get to the chaylev of the kidneys, then you got to stop. Eat around it, be'etzim. And for the Gemara, in that particular case with Rabbi Yochanan, we're talking about a weak kid. The kid was weak. And because it was weak, Tosfos gives two possibilities for what it means. Right? It says either because it's weak, therefore the flavor didn't spread. Right? That since the kid was weak, its chaylev wasn't going to bubble and spread the way that a healthy animal would. But alternatively, there wasn't a lot of it. It was batel b'shishim, says Tosfos. Therefore, there was no concern about the flavor spreading because it was batel b'shishim. But what if you got to the kidneys and there was chaylev on it, you couldn't eat that, so you could eat around it. But anyways, the Gemara answers, it was a weak kid, and for that reason, there was no concern about the chaylev spreading. But when Rav Huna said you even can't eat the ear meat, right, the meat by the ears, so that was a healthy kid. Rav Huna bar Yehuda Amar kulya b'chelba hava v'sharya. Rav Huna bar Yehuda says the case that came before Rabbi Yochanan there was not actually a kid that was cooked with its chaylev. The question was a kidney that was cooked with its chaylev. We learned the other day that on a kidney there are different membranes. The kidney itself has a membrane around it, and then there's chaylev that surrounds the kidney, and there's a membrane in the chaylev. We said the membrane of the chaylev is considered like chaylev for sure. But we said that there's a lower membrane around the kidney. And what happened was, Rabbi Yochanan said that the kidney itself, below the membrane, the kidney itself is mutter, because the membrane around it protects it from the chaylev. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan was saying, the kidney itself is mutter. Tosfos says you would at least have to leave kind of like a basic, right? What does Tosfos say? You should also remove a little bit of the kidney itself, but be'etzim, the kidney itself is okay because the membrane around the kidney protected the kidney itself from the chaylev that was around it. So again, Rav Huna bar Yehuda Amar kulya b'chelba. The scenario that came before Rabbi Yochanan in that scenario was actually just a kidney that was roasted with its chaylev. V'sharya, and Rabbi Yochanan said that it is permitted because the membrane around the kidney protected the kidney itself from the chaylev. Rav Ada Amar kilchas be'ilpis hava. It was kilchas be'ilpis. It was these little fish shrotzim that got mixed in a pot of meat. What happened was they were cooking a meat stew, and some kilchas be'ilfas got in there. Some little fish sheretzes. Sounds kind of nasty. They got mixed into the meat stew, and they said to Rabbi Yochanan, "What do we do?" So he said, "This is what you do. It's min, right? You have these sheretz fishes which are Issur that got mixed. Right, it's Issur got mixed together with the meat which is heter, and therefore it is benosein tam. Thing is, how are you going to taste it? Like we talked about in the Mishnah, how are you going to taste it? Right? You can't. There's some Issur that's potentially a problem. So he says his suggestion is litame kfila aramoya. What you do is you find a non-Jewish baker. You find a non-Jewish baker and you ask him to taste the stew for you and ask him what he tastes. Tosfos points out that Davka, we're talking about a non-Jewish baker, a person who has certain skin in the game. If he turns out to be a liar, right, he's going to lose. People aren't going to want to buy from him anymore. So, right, what does that say? Kevon tikfilu, since he's a baker, lo meshakar, he's not going to lie. Shelo yafsed Umnosu said he won't lose. I assume it means his profession. Keilu, he has a reputation that he has to maintain, so he's going to tell the truth. Rashi says, don't tell him, hey, we need you to tell us if you could taste these sheretz in here so we can know if it's kosher or not. Don't tell him it has anything to do with kashrus. You have to say, hey, can you taste the stew? Tell me what you taste. And he doesn't know that it has anything to do with Issur V'Heter, and he'll tell you his honest opinion of what he thinks about the dish. And based on that, you can determine if you can taste those bugs in the stew or not, and that will be your gauge, your indicator of nosein tam, of can you taste these fish sheretzes in the stew based on the feedback that you receive from this non-Jewish baker. Now the Gemara is going to discuss how to check for flavor. We've been primarily understanding nosein tam literally, which is, can you literally taste the Issur in the heter? We mentioned a little bit shishim. Let's talk about this now. So how do you check for flavor? Amar Rava says, Rav Meiresh, initially, have a kokashli. Initially, I was perplexed. Haditani, that which we learned in a brayso, kideru shebisha b'basar, lo yivashal b'chalav, that a meat pot, if you have a meat pot, don't be cooking dairy in a meat pot. Ve'imbishel b'nosein tam. And if you did cook milk in a meat pot, so then is the milk mutter or asur? We say, well, if you can taste the meat in the milk, it's asur. If it's b'nosein tam, it's asur. Truma, lo yivashal b'chulin. If you cooked truma in a pot, don't then cook chulin in that pot. The imbishel b'nosein tam. And if you did cook chulin in the pot, well then you're gonna have to. So the question is, did the truma impart flavor in the chulin? So let's say you had truma olive oil. Let's say you were cooking with olive oil of truma, and it got absorbed in the pot, and then afterwards you were cooking, I don't know, some chulin, some whatever it might be, and whatever you were cooking in the pot. And the question is now, can you taste the olive oil that was truma in whatever other stuff, the chulin that you're cooking in the pot? So bishlama truma ta'im leikoin. So in terms of how do we know if you can taste the truma olive oil in the chulin that you're now cooking? So you go to a kohen, because a kohen is allowed to eat chulin and he's allowed to eat truma. And you say to the kohen, here, can you taste this dish that I'm cooking, the food that I'm cooking, and let me know, can you taste olive oil in it? Because that olive oil is truma, and he'll tell you what he tastes. And if he says, I can taste the olive oil, so then it's nosein tam. If not, it's not nosein tam. So bishlama truma toim leikoin, ela basa b'chalav man toim le. But how are you going to check for basa b'chalav? How are you going to know if the meat from the pot that was absorbed in the pot is now nosein tam to the chalav? Who's tasting that? You can't taste it because there's a potential basa b'chalav there. So hashta da Amar Rabbi Yochanan samchina nakfila armaya. But now that Rabbi Yochanan said, well, you can ask a non-Jewish baker to taste it for you. Well, there's our answer. How do you know if there's basar b'chalav? How do you know if you could taste the flavor of the meat that was absorbed in the pot in the milk that's now cooking in the pot? You can ask a non-Jewish baker to do a taste test for you and let you know. Omar Ravit says, Ravit, fine, we'll ask the non-Jewish baker by basar b'chalav. Now, Amar Rava says, Rava, Amar Rabbanan b'taima, v'Amar Rabbanan b'kfila, v'Amar Rabbanan b'shishim. Rava asks the question that I'm sure many of us are either asking ourselves now or have asked ourselves in the past, which is, this is all a little bit confusing. We talk about tam, we talk about nosein tam, right? We say, right, Amar Rabbanan b'taima. We talked about how if you have truma and chulin, you give it to a kohen, and he literally tastes it and tells you what he tastes. The rabbis say, and in other cases, you have to go to a non-Jewish baker. What about, when do we say shishim? When do we say, who cares what it tastes like? You make a cheshbon. There's this volume of this, there's that volume of that. Is it 60? Is the volume of the heter 60 versus one volume, right? One of the Issur kilu. When do we say what? When do we say taste it? When do we say, when do we say a kohen taste it? When do we say a non-Jew taste it? When do we say forget about tasting? Let's just make a calculation. When do we say what? Hilkach. Here's the answer. Here's what you say what. Min b'she'eno mino. When you have min b'she'eno mino de'atera. So for example, you have olive oil of truma that gets mixed together with, I don't know, you're cooking barley in the pot, whatever it might be. So you have chulin. So there are two different types of foods with two different distinct flavors, and they're both mutter, maybe not to a Yisrael, because you have to be concerned about truma, but go to a kohen, he could taste both of them. So b'taima, so you go to a kohen and you ask him to taste it for you and let you know, you have olive oil, barley, whatever. Do you taste the olive oil in the barley? The Issura bikfila, and if we're talking about basar v'chalav, for example, so we can't go to a kohen or any other yid, but we can go to a non-Jewish baker. Umin bimino dilekalemeka matayma, and if we're talking about min bimino, right, if we're talking about truma olive oil, and then you cooked another dish that had chulin olive oil, and all olive oil is going to taste the same, and there's no way to distinguish if you're tasting the chulin olive oil or the truma olive oil. So right, meaning chulin and truma olive oil, so everything tastes the same. Inami, alternatively, min b'she'eno mino, if they have distinct flavors like basar b'chalav, the Issura, Veleka kfila, but there's no non-Jewish baker to taste, right? I can't think of any non-Jewish bakers who live around here, b'shishim. Well, in that case, either because it's min mino, where it all just, they're all just, olive oil and olive oil, it's all just going to taste like olive oil. You can't distinguish the Issur from the heter, or if it's Issur heter, but we don't necessarily have a non-Jewish baker to ask, b'shishim. The answer is, you calculate if it's 60 parts heter per 1 part Issur, so then it is kosher. And that be'etzem, I think shishim we can basically apply to all of the scenarios. So whether min b'mino, min b'she'eno mino, whether you can taste it or not, if you have a cheshbon of 60 parts heter to 1 part Issur, so then it would be considered kosher. But if you don't have 60 parts to 1 part, so then it is not, it is Issur. Okay, let me chap a shtickle coffee, we'll go weiter. Says the Gemara, Hanu atmehasa de imlichu beresh gelusa. They were by the exilarch, by the head honcho in Babble, and there they had a leg of a animal, and it was salted. Begida nasha, and the gida nasha was still in there. So they had a leg of an animal, and its gida nasha was in it, and they had salted the leg of the animal. Ravina Issur, Ravina says you can't eat the meat of that leg. Rav Acha, you can skip by Rav Ashi Shari. Rav Acha said that the leg is permitted. Also Shailua Lemar Rav Ashi, they asked Mar Rav Ashi, Amalu Abba Shari, Mar Rav Ashi said my father Rav Ashi would permit it. Okay, so we had this hind leg of the animal with the gid anasha still in it. It was salted. Ravina said the leg is Issur, Rav Acha said it's mutter, and Mar Rav Ashi quoted his father that it is mutter. Amarle Rav Acha, skip the next 2 words, Ravina. So Rav Acha says to Ravina, my daitich, Ravina, why are you saying that all the meat is Issur? The Amar Shmuel, meaning the meat of the leg with the gid anosha, is Issur. The Amar Shmuel, Maliach hareu kiroseach, kavush hareu kimuvoshul. Is it because Shmuel says that Maliach, if something is salted, if in this case this meat is salted, hareu kiroseach, it's like it is scalded. Kavush hareu kimuvoshul, and if something is pickled, fermented, it's like it is cooked. But Shmuel said, Lo shanu elishin is bashel ba, aval nitzla ba kolef, v'ochat shemagia legid. Right? What did Shmuel say at the very beginning of our Gemara today? Shmuel made a distinction between cooking and roasting. He said that by cooking, the leg would be Issur, all the meat of the leg would be Issur, but by roasting, you can eat around the gid anosha. You can eat the outer layers. Now, Rav Acha is continuing to press Ravina, and he says, no. So if what you're going to tell me is that meliach, that salting the leg, is like mevushal, it's like cooking the leg, but that can't be. Shmuel's statement was twofold. He says that salting is like roseach, and fermenting is like cooking, is like mevushal. So if fermenting is like cooking, so memela salting is like roasting, kasha. It's a question. So what just happened? Let's talk about it outside. So let's talk about it outside for a second. So there was this leg, this hind leg of the animal, and it was salted. Ravina said you're not allowed to eat it. Rav Acha says you are allowed to eat it, and that was backed up by Mar Bar Avashi, who said his father Rav Ashi also said you'd be allowed to eat it. And Rav Acha asked the kasha to Ravina. He says, Ravina, why would it not be allowed? Right? The reason why you're saying it would not be allowed is because it's salted. And there's a concept of maliach areu kiroseach, that something is salted, it's like it's scalded. So Rav Acha was asking Ravina, it sounds like you're assuming that when we say that something is salted, it's like it's scalded, i.e. it's essentially treated like it's cooked. And we had said at the beginning of the Gemara that something that is cooked, if you cook the gid anosha, so then all of the flavor of the gid anosha goes throughout the meat. And therefore, Ravina, if you're considering salting like cooking, so then you would say that all of the meat is Issur. The only problem with that, points out Rav Acha, is that Shmuel says that salting is like scalding, but then there's another part of that statement, which is fermenting is like cooking. So if we're saying that fermenting is like cooking, then that implies when we say that salting is like scalding, that scalding would basically be not like cooking, but rather like roasting, and therefore you should be able to peel around, or eat the layers of meat around it, and leave the gid anosha. And the Gemara says that it is a question. Ravina did not have an answer. Now the Gemara asks a really interesting question. Or is it even a question? No, it's more of a statement. But it's like Jeopardy. We're going to ask the question. How do you calculate shishim, right? So we talked about shishim earlier, right? Essentially, shishim is a stand-in for tam. Whenever we talk about no saying tam, if you have Issur and heter, we say, can you taste the Issur in the heter? It's shishim. My understanding is that's basically volume, calculated based on volume. So if you look at the volume of the Issur and the volume of the heter, if there's 60 times, if the volume of the heter is 60 times out of the Issur, so then it is mutar. Now, what can we include in the heter to kind of, what's it called? Kind of stack kind of pile it up and kind of pile up the stack of, I'm saying there's definitely a phrase that I just either don't know or can't think about it. Stack the odds or whatever, maybe stack the odds. Basically, we want to obviously have access to as much heter as we can to overwhelm the Issur, right? So what can we include in the heter? So says the Gemara, Amr Reb Chanina, says Reb Chanina Kshein, Mishayrin, when we're making this cheshbin of heter against Issur, Mishayrin birotev, we can include in the heter any liquid that's in the pot, uvikipa, any sediment, any pieces that are at the bottom of the pot, uvachatichos, and the other pieces as well. So let's say you have a piece of non-kosher meat that falls into a pot of kosher meat, so you can include the pieces of kosher meat. And now here's the tricky one, right? So we talked about the liquid, the sediments, the other pieces of meat in there, the other food in there, uvikdeira, and the pot itself. This is where it gets a little tricky. I mean, It's tricky just because it's unclear what it means. Ikar da'amri b'kedera atzmo v'ikar da'amri b'mai debola kedera. To those who say that what the pot, right, we're saying we also include the pot in the cheshbon of heter. To those who say that it literally means the pot itself, the question is, what does it mean, the pot itself? But the pot itself, let's say the pot is, the actual mass of the pot is 60 olives worth. So you can add 60 olives worth to the cheshbon of heter. Okay, that's one way, and we'll talk about that. We'll get back to that in a second. The other option by kedera is that which was absorbed in the pot, right? My debola kedera, that which was the flavor of the heter that was absorbed in the pot can be used as part of the cheshbon of heter. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, this pot thing, what to do with it, right? The liquid, the sediment, the other pieces, that's pretty straightforward. In terms of the pot, so we have two options here. One is the actual mass of the pot. Now, Tosfos asked a very interesting question. Tosfos says, what if you have a pot and the mass of the pot is 50 olives worth? Is the right that's the volume of the pot, the mass of the pot. Are those the same or not? I don't know. But the pot itself is 50 olives worth. In the pot, you put in 10 zaysim, 10 olives worth of water. And then you drop in a kazayis of chaylev. So be'etzim, the contents of the pot are 10 kazaysim of water and 1 kazayis of chaylev. Are you telling me that between the 50 zaysim of the pot, the 10 zaysim of water, so that's 50 and 10, 60 to the 1 kazayis of chaylev that's cooking in there, you're telling me that you're going to be unable to taste that chaylev in the water? You have 10 kazaysim of water, 1 kazayis of chaylev. You're telling me that you'll be unable to taste the chaylev in the water because it's shishim when you include the mass of the pot? That doesn't really make sense. So Tosfos says that when we talk about the mass of the pot, that's talking about a scenario where you had initially cooked mutter stuff in the pot, and mutter flavor was absorbed in the pot. And then you cooked a kazayis of chaylev in that pot, and a kazayis of chaylev was absorbed in the pot. So the chaylev that we're talking about is not actual Issur mamish, Issur be'en, actual mamish Issur in the pot, in the food. Rather, we're talking about chaylev that was absorbed in the pot previously. And in the pot, there was heter that had already been previously absorbed in the pot, and Issur that was already previously absorbed in the pot. And now you're cooking more permitted foods. And the question is, wait, you're cooking permitted food in a pot that absorbed in it was a kazayis of chaylev, but also lots of other heter. So really the question is, when we're talking about including the cheshbon of the pot, it's when you have some chaylev that was absorbed in the pot previously, after the pot was already had absorbed lots of heter before the chaylev, and now you have mutter food. So the question is, can the pot be included in the cheshbon to cancel out the flavor of the chaylev that was already absorbed in the pot? Okay, that's part of the question of can you include the pot or not. That's what Tosfos says. Rashi didn't say that. I think according to him, the cheshbon is like, can you literally use the pot itself? But Rashi then says, he says, look, the Gemara gave us two options over here. The pot itself or just the flavor that was absorbed in the pot. So because we're talking about an Issur d'oraisa over here, right, Issur v'heter, so we have to be stringent. So he says, for sure we can't go with the pot anyways. Forget about that. And in terms of the flavor, so can you also include whatever flavor was absorbed from the food in the pot? Can you use that flavor that was absorbed into the pot against the Issur? Well, he says, look, at the end of the day, just like heter flavor was absorbed in the pot, so was Issur flavor was also absorbed in the pot. So it's hard to say that you'll be able to use the heter flavor that was absorbed in the pot without actually having to also acknowledge that there's also Issur that was absorbed in the pot. Rashi basically says at the end of the day, you can't really use the pot. It's not really so shaykh. Okay, the Rambam talks about using the flavor. Anyways, yeah, it's a little bit, I didn't look up la'alacha what to do, but this concept of using the pot is a trickery one. Rashi says, the Rosh also mentions Rashi's shita here. I saw in the Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam that he says that the Rif also basically leaves out the pot thing. Seems like using the pot is a little bit tricky. But in terms of being able to use the liquid in the pot, the sediment of the pot, the other pieces in the pot against the Issur, that for sure we can use. Amar Babble, says Babble, Amar Yechanan, Kol Issurin Shebatorah Misharinon Ki'ilu Ein Botzel V'Kaflut. Very interesting. Back to the question that we had in the Mishnah, right? When you have Issur V'Heter, and since then as well, when you have Issur V'Heter, you can't actually taste it to see if there's tam or not. So what do? So it says, Rabbi Babble in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, what you do is, whatever the Issur is, whether it's pork that fell into something, or some tamei fish, or whatever it is, whatever it is that fell in, we take the Issur and we imagine that it is, what do we say? Onion or leek. Onion and leek have a relatively potent flavor, have a relatively flavorful flavor. So let's say you had pork that fell into some meat, and the question is the pork no sein tam? So how are we going to know? We can't taste it to see if we could taste the pork. What we could do is we can say, well, what if that equivalent of pork was onion or leek? Would you be able to taste the onion or leek in the meat? If the answer is yes, then it's no sein tam, and if the answer is no, then we assume that it wouldn't be no sein tam. Amalei Reb Abel Abai says, Reb Abba Tabai, v'sharinu bepilpulin v'tavlin dafilu be'elef lo b'telin. Says Reb Abba Tabai, if the idea is to consider the Issur as though it's onion or leek because they're very flavorful, why not say that we view the Issur as if it's spices, as if it's pepper, as if it's other spices which are way more flavorful? And therefore, basically, even the smallest amount of Issur, if we were imagining that it was spices, of course you'd be able to taste that. So if we're talking about we want to have a particularly flavorful substance that we're using to gauge, use spices. So Amalei, Abaye answers, Shiaru chachomim de nosin tam be'isurin yosem mibotzel v'kaflut. Says Abaye, he answers, look, the chachomim made a cheshbin that any kind of Issur that we're talking about that might fall in, whether it's basar b'chalav, maybe some pork or some tamei fish or whatever it is that fell in, any Issur that would fall into a cooked dish wouldn't get more pungent and more flavorful than onions and leek. I saw in a note in the art scroll that, but what about the fact that you could have spices that are like orla or something like that, or tevel? So that could potentially fall into a dish, and so shouldn't we be concerned? So since those could fall into a dish, so we do have to be concerned about particularly pungent stuff falling into a dish. So I saw an answer there that in the art scroll that the thing is, when it comes to those spices that are orla, since you can have literally the same spices that are not orla, you can literally just test it out. If you have a pot of meat and some orla spices fell into it, well, you would be able to just make another pot of meat, get not orla spices, permitted spices that are right. So let's say some pepper fell in, put that equivalent amount into the meat and see for yourself. We're talking about things where you are on it, right? Pork falls into this. There's no way that you can actually literally test if the pork is going to impart flavor. So there we say anything like that, right? That any kind of Issur that are entirely Assur and there's no mutter version of it, they're never going to be more pungent than onions or leek, and therefore we can always use, when we have Issur v'eter, you can use, well, if that amount of onion or leek were to fall into the dish, wouldn't impart flavor. Now, this, of course, is assuming that we're literally looking for flavor. once we have the concept of shishim, everything ultimately becomes a cheshbon of a mathematical calculation. Is it 60 to 1? We're not really doing things based on can you actually taste it or not, right? Once we talk about, look, because we talked in the Mishnah, we talked about the gid anoshe. We don't use leek and onion. We said we use meat and turnip, which is more mild, right? So we say, look, ultimately, in the end, we kind of landed on shishim as being kind of the cheshbon, but this was assuming that we're still going based on actual flavor and what can be tasted or not. And they said that when it comes to Issurim, you would use as a gauge onions and leeks. And now we discuss the concept of a cow's udder getting mixed into a mixture. Is a little bit of a technical and a little bit of a tricky question, but I think in principle, I'm going to try to explain it, I guess, as we work through it rather than explain it outside now. Let's see. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman gid b'shishim ven gid min aminin. So if a gid anoshe gets mixed together in a dish, so we're talking about shishim, aside from the gid anoshe itself. So you have to have 60 parts heter against 1 part gid anoshe. Chal is an udder. B'shishim v'chal min aminin. When it comes to an udder, if an udder gets mixed together with other meat, so it would be shishim, but in this case, the udder is part of so instead of 60 parts to 1 part, it's 59 parts of meat to 1 part of udder, because in the udder itself, the meat of the udder itself is mutter. So this udder consists of meat and also milk. Now the thing is, when it comes to milk, what is not allowed is meat with milk that has already been extracted from the cow. Once the cow has been milked, so then meat cannot be mixed with that milk. That's an Issur mid'oraisa. But milk that is still inside the cow, so if you shecht a cow and there's milk in the udder, that milk is mutter mid'oraisa, but also mid'orabbanan. So now you have this udder, and in the udder there is milk. So we're saying that the meat of the udder is mutter, but the milk, we're going to say, is asur. So if you have 59 parts meat, plus the udder, which we're going to say that the meat of the udder contributes to kind of 60 parts meat to the milk. Okay, so we say, so when you have an udder, it's basically, right, so chal, an udder is b'shishim as well, but chal min aminyan. The udder is part of the cheshbon, so basically it's 59 parts to 1 as opposed to, right, it's 1/60th as opposed to 60 to 1. Beitza, and if we're talking about a non-kosher egg, an egg from a non-kosher bird, b'shishim, the ain beitza min aminin, so that's shishim, and the egg is not included, so it's 60 parts to 1. The only exception was the udder. Amr b'yitzchak breder of misharsha u'chal atzmo asur. Says Rabbi Yitzchak breder of misharsha, and the udder itself is asur, right? So if you have this udder that falls into this mixture, the udder itself is asur. You got to take it out. You can't eat it. V'i nafal likidera acheres, and if after having fallen to the first dish, this udder then falls into another dish, that udder will be considered Issur in that other dish as though it were nevela. Amr of Ashi says of Ashi Kavina Beir of Kana, when we buy the Bismillah of Kana, we buy of Kana, Ibarlam we ask, Ki Misharinon Bedide Misharinon o B'mai Dunafak Mine Misharinon. It's a little bit tricky to understand what this means. So maybe let's start with the second part first. Right? Right? So in terms of calculating shishim, how do we calculate it? Do we say, well, maybe only part of the milk left the udder, and therefore we're basically just kind of comparing the part that left the udder and is imparting flavor in the rest of the meat. So is it only the milk that left the udder that we're considering in the cheshbon of shishim, or this is the first part, obedide misharinan, do we assume that all of the milk has left the udder? Okay, and what kind of cheshbon are we making over here? We're basically using the udder itself, right? The udder that we pulled out, and we're going to now use that udder itself to compare it with the rest of the meat to see if it's shishim against it, right? So meaning we're saying that all the milk has left the udder, and it's now now the milk is in all the rest of the meat, and we're comparing the udder itself to see if that udder is one part to shishim of the rest, right? Meaning when you add the udder with the milk, we said it's the udder to 59 parts meat, because we said that the meat of the udder itself would contribute would join the other 59 parts. But here now we're saying, now that the milk has left the udder and you're extracting the udder, we're saying we're going to compare the udder to the whole rest of the mixture and see if it's with the milk in it and see if it's 60 parts to the udder. Okay. So pshita de bedide misharinon, we say, well, it's going to be comparing the full udder to the mixture, because if we're comparing to the milk, right, only we assume that part of the milk left and we're comparing it to the part that left, how are we going to know exactly what that is? So rather what we have to work with is the udder itself, and we'll say, is the udder itself one part to 60 parts of the mixture? But if we're saying that all the milk left the udder, well then let's say that if the udder now falls into a different pot, it should not make the other pot Issur, since all the milk has already left. So came the Amr of Yitzchak Breder Mishashe v'Kchal Atzmo Issur, since Rav Yitzchak Breder Mishashe says that the udder itself becomes Issur in the mixture. So Shavio Rabban Chaticha de Nevela, we have to treat it at this point like it's Nevela, and if it falls into another pot, it'll make the Issur pot Issur b'shishim, as though it were Nevela. Okay, that was a little bit technical and tricky sugya there with this udder. But Chevra, that was Daf Tzadi Zayin, Daf 97 of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Tzadi Zayin of Masechta Chullin, we got the ball rolling here with Issur v'Heter Ta'arovos. In my opinion, a very exciting sugya that I'm looking forward to learning, because it's just such a core sugya. It feels like, particularly anybody who's studying for smicha, I never did, but I know that people do, and when they do, this is like Tarovos is the big one. It feels like it's the big one. So we learned the Mishnah about the Gid Anosha being cooked with the rest of the leg, and we talked about no Saint Tam. The Gemara talked about cooking versus roasting. That when you're cooking the Gid Anosha, so then the Issur prohibits all of the meat, that it's considered that the liquids in the pot transferred the flavor from the Gid Anosha throughout the meat, and it's all Issur. Whereas if you're roasting it, so then you can eat the outer layers until the meat. It's not considered like the Gid Anosha permeated all and the flavor spread throughout all of the meat. Rather, you can eat the meat around the Gid Anosha. We discussed how to check for flavor. We said if it's mutter min b'she'eno mino, so for example, truma, you can ask a kohen to taste it for you. If it's Issur min b'she'eno mino, for example, meat and milk, pasur b'chalav, so you can ask a non-Jewish baker to taste it for you. Rashi says you have to make sure to ask him lefi tumo, right? Don't tell him you have an Issur v'Heter question. Can you help us? Rather say, hey, tell me what this tastes like. We want to get your opinion. And see what he says. Tosfos said that Dafka, a baker who, he has a business that, he wants to be honest. So, because if he lies, then people won't want to bake. It could be Dafka, a baker, because, Pas Akum, we learned about a year ago, Masechta Avodah Zarah right? So that's okay. So, you wouldn't want to lose his Jewish customers, I imagine. And otherwise, if you can't have a kohen taste it or a non-Jewish taste it, there's no way to actually taste it, you can go based on shishim, which I think basically is I think you can, it could be a stand-in for taste in general, that we have this calculation of if there are 60 parts of heter to 1 part Issur, which then gets to the question of how to calculate shishim. When we're talking about the 60 parts of heter, what can be used, what can be included in the 60 parts heter to 1 part Issur. We said for sure the liquids itself, for sure the sediments at the bottom of the pot, for sure the other pieces of meat or whatever the other pieces of heter are in the pot, for sure that can all be used. Then we got to the tricky question of what about the pot itself? The Gemara gave 2 options. Maybe it means literally the volume of the pot itself. We had Tosfos say that that's maybe specifically only if we're talking about chaylev that got absorbed in the pot. But anyways, the pot itself, or just the flavor that's absorbed in the pot, the heter flavor that's absorbed in the pot can be used. That was a question. Rashi says that, practically speaking, the pot the pot angle is unusable, because after all, the Gemara gave 2 different possibilities, and we have to go to the Chumrah because it's Issur D'Oraisa, and there are questions about how to use the flavor, because just like there's flavor in the pot from the heter, there's also flavor in the pot from the Issur. Anyways, Rashi says practically speaking, it's not usable. And then we talked about udders in the mix, that when it comes to udders, so it's a ratio of 59-1 as opposed to 60-1. The udder itself is forbidden, and it will make subsequent mixtures forbidden as though it were nevela. Givaldik. Friends, that was Daf 97 of Masechta Chullin. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you're as excited about the sugya as I am. I hope you have a great day. I'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers.